If your dream is to become an agent of immigration and customs enforcement, better known as ICE, to experience what it might feel like to be an ICE agent, that is, an agent who theoretically regulates and controls a country's immigration and customs, or even to fight against ICE, then I've got the perfect top for you. Here you can simulate with overwhelming similarity the day-to-day life of an ICE agent. Each of these games focuses on different aspects of how an ICE agent, or something very close to it, experiences their daily routine. They are not presenting as political games, they do not use real names, they do not mention specific organizations or acronyms, yet they reproduce with unsettling accuracy the logic of real-world systems of migration control, surveillance, and institutional exclusion. Systems that, in the United States, are often associated with a single word: ICE. This video is not about accusing anyone or turning a video game into an ideological pamphlet. It deals with something far more uncomfortable, analyzing how certain games have turned into playable mechanics the very same processes that, outside the screen, generate deep ethical debates. Processes such as deciding who can enter, who must be rejected, who deserves help, and who is automatically classified as an administrative problem. Without further delay, let's begin with Papers, Please. Papers, Please is probably the clearest and hardest to ignore example, not because it tries to be provocative, but because its design is brutally honest. The game places you in the role of a border officer in a fictional country, but from the very first minute, it makes one thing clear. The political context is secondary. What matters is not where you are, but how the system you are operating actually works. Your job consists of reviewing documents, passports, visas, work permits, medical certificates, comparing dates, stamps, and names, detecting minimal inconsistencies, all of these under constant time pressure. Every person who passes through your booth is not, from a mechanical standpoint, an individual with a personal story, but a set of data points that must align with regulations that are constantly changing. This is where the parallel with ICE appears in an almost surgical way. The game does not ask you to be cruel, nor to take pleasure in others' suffering. It asks you to be efficient, and that is precisely where its power lies. Empathy is not forbidden, but it's penalized. Hesitation costs money. Mistakes lead to sanctions, and those sanctions directly affect the survival of your own family. As the hours pass, the player learns an uncomfortable lesson. The system does not require conscious villains. It requires ordinary people following procedures. The moral dilemma does not arise from a single exceptional decision, but from the constant repetition of small, seemingly neutral choices. Papers, Please does not simulate physical violence, but it simulates something equally powerful: bureaucratic dehumanization. Not Tonight. If Papers, Please represents the border, Not Tonight represents the inside of the system. Here, you do not work at a checkpoint, but at seemingly trivial doors. Nightclubs, events, private buildings, however, the function is the same. Controlling access, deciding who gets in and who stays out. The crucial difference is that in Not Tonight, you yourself are an immigrant. You are not a comfortable, distant, authority figure. You're someone trapped within a system that forces you to apply rules that directly harm you. The parallel with the ICE is not found in aesthetics, but in power structures. Migration control is not always exercised through weapons or raids. More often, it operates through precarious jobs, constantly changing regulations, and delegated responsibility. The game introduces an especially disturbing layer. Doing your job well means excluding people whose situations are almost identical to your own. The system does not explicitly force you, it simply makes it clear that failing to comply has economic, legal, and personal consequences. Not Tonight shows how oppression can function in a decentralized, normalized, and almost invisible way, turning vulnerable individuals into unwilling executors of the same logic that oppresses them. Beholder shifts the focus from border control to prior surveillance. Here, you do not decide who crosses a border, but who deserves to be watched, reported, or removed from the social system. You are the manager of a residential building in a totalitarian state, but once again, the specific political context is irrelevant. What matters is the mechanic. You install cameras, spy on private conversations, search belongings, and decide what information to pass on to the state. The parallel with ICE emerges in the least visible phase of migration control: information gathering. Before any deportation, before any detention, there is a process of classification, surveillance, and labeling. Beholder is especially unsettling because it does not force you to report people, it incentivizes you to do so. Every act of collaboration provides stability, resources, and security for your family. Every act of resistance introduces risk, precarity, and punishment. The game does not pose a heroic dilemma. It asks a far more realistic question. How far are you willing to go to sacrifice others in order to preserve your own sense of normality? Tonight We Riot. Tonight We Riot approaches the idea of institutional control from the opposite angle to the previous games. Instead of placing you inside the system, it puts you directly against it. The game is set on a dystopian society where economic and political power is concentrated in the hands of a small elite, enforced through militarized police and state violence. While the game never mentions ICE explicitly, the parallels are clear: repression, surveillance, and the normalization of force against marginalized groups. Mechanically, the game rejects the idea of an individual hero. You don't play as a single character but as a collective. When one protester dies, another immediately takes their place. What matters is not the individual, but the size and strength of the crowd. The larger your group, the more powerful you become, reinforcing the game's central message that collective action outweighs individual resistance. Narratively, Tonight We Riot functions as a direct response to systems like those seen in Papers, Please or Not Tonight. If those games show how control is enforced quietly through bureaucracy and procedure, this game shows what happens when that control becomes visible, violent, and impossible to ignore. It's not subtle and it's not meant to be. The game exists to illustrate that when institutional exclusion becomes normalized, confrontation is no longer a choice, it's an outcome. This war of mine is not about immigration or borders. It's impossible not to see it as the final outcome of policies of exclusion and control. The game focuses on civilians trapped in an armed conflict, displaced, lacking resources, and without institutional protection. People whose existence falls outside any administrative framework capable of defending them. From a mechanical perspective, the game is a succession of impossible moral decisions. Who you help, who you abandon, who you sacrifice in order to survive one more day. There are no explicit punishments or moral judgments. The game simply records the consequences. In this sense, this war of mine functions as the human epilogue to the systems represented in the older games. It does not depict control itself, but the void left behind when that control fails, or when it is applied without consideration for the people affected. For the final game, we have Ready or Not. Ready or Not can easily be interpreted as a game where you play the role of an ICE agent, not because it explicitly deals with immigration, but because it simulates the operational power and procedural mindset associated with agencies like ICE. You act as a state authority entering civilian spaces under legal justification, executing raids, detaining individuals, and enforcing order through strict protocols rather than open warfare. The game places heavy emphasis on procedure. You don't rush in blindly, you clear rooms methodically, secure civilians, restrain suspects, and make judgment calls that directly affect the outcome of each operation. Success is not measured by how many enemies you eliminate, but by how closely you follow institutional rules. Excessive force is penalized, hesitation is punished, and every action is evaluated by an external system that mirrors bureaucratic oversight. What makes Ready or Not feel ICE-like is not its subject matter, but its structure of authority. You enter private homes, workplaces, and apartments with absolute legal power. Civilians are compliant, confused, or terrified. Some are guilty, others are not. But the game makes it clear that compliance with procedure matters more than intent. You're not there to empathize, you are there to enforce. In this sense, Ready or Not functions as a procedural enforcement simulator. It captures what it feels like to operate as an arm of the state within civilian environments, where legality, control, and restraint define success more than heroism or violence. Even without mentioning immigration, the experience closely resembles what many imagine when they think of playing as an ICE agent, executing lawful but morally complex operations where human lives are reduced to protocol, compliance, and report. None of these games mention ICE, and that is precisely why the parallel is so powerful. They are not interested in criticizing a specific institution, but in representing a logic, the transformation of human beings into administrative variables, the replacement of moral responsibility with procedural compliance, and the normalization of decisions that outside the screen carry devastating consequences. These games do not make us comfortable because they are exaggerated, but because we recognize real structures within them. They feel familiar because they reproduce systems that already exist, and perhaps the most uncomfortable question they raise is not whether these games are ethical or not, but why their logic feels so easy to accept once it has been gamified.